initiative, both for setting up this event and then also helping fund so much research, and I think really help give so much support to our patients. And thank you all for coming to listen. So I think before we get into some research updates, I think it helps have a framework and just kind of cover some of the basics of what we'll be discussing today. And also just put a plug in for Lung Cancer Awareness Month. I think it's an exciting month. And certainly encourage anyone to join any of the events as you've seen listed. But I think this is a time for hope and a lot of advancement that we're coming in our research and hopefully continue to do so in the future. So just to start at the beginning, we think, what is lung cancer? It's ultimately a cancer in the cells lining the airways of the lungs in such a way that one of the cells is mutated or changed so that it breaks those rules of normal growth. And you might hear us a lot about talking about these things called driver mutations, but we use this biomarker testing to look for some mutations that we can actually target with treatment. And so why is lung cancer important? Well, it's the leading cause of cancer death worldwide. When we think about in comparison to other cancers, say breast cancer, we actually expect more women to pass from lung cancer, or nearly twice as many women to pass from lung cancer than from breast cancer. So I think it's a really important focus for us to increase both research, support for our patients, and try to advance everything we're doing going forward. How do we stage lung cancer? Just for the purposes of the talk, to again get a little bit of a framework. I like to think about it as it's the cancer located just in our lungs or the middle of the chest, so kind of our stage 1 to 3, or has it spread to more distant or further parts? So it's more metastatic as we use the term. And how we traditionally classified lung cancer, we usually think about it as how it looked under the microscope as non-small cell or small cell, but that's something that's changed over time, and we'll briefly touch on that. Traditionally, we thought of kind of 3 modalities for cancer treatment in general, that involving surgery, can you go in and cut it out, radiation, can you try to zap it away, and chemotherapy, which is primarily what I do, is giving treatment through an IV. But I think what we found is how can we personalize that and how can we make our treatments more precise, both to target and treat the cancer better, but also to minimize any side effects. And we've come to find that we can target some of our therapy towards these mutations, helping drive the tumor, and also using our own immune system to try to fight off and keep off the cancer as well. And so I don't want to get too bogged down in this picture, but I think it's a nice representation of how far we've come in our understanding of lung cancer and how we're using that to try to treat it as well. And so, as I mentioned before, traditionally we looked at how it was under the microscope and how it acted, but we found that we can actually look closer at the tumor itself and the mutations and how the immune system's involved in there to break it apart. And so we'll certainly, Dr. Mileham will be talking much more about from a biomarker perspective. I just wanted to touch base a little bit on the immune signature in the tumor, since that's some of what my research will be covering. So how do we link immunotherapy? And you might hear this biomarker called PD-L1. So immunotherapy is a way we're trying to awaken our immune system to kill off cancer cells. And what we found is there's a protein called PD-1 on our T cells, these cells that help fight off infection, but also help fight off cancers, is that the tumor cell is using this as a way to hide from the system. So I kind of think about it as the tumor cell is like the security guard at the bus stop with the stop sign saying, stop, I'm okay, don't come at me. And what we found is we can develop these checkpoint inhibitors like immunotherapy to try to block that and kind of switch that stop sign to a green light to go ahead and try to take out the cancer. And so how do we look from a biomarker percentage, or how do we look at how well we might expect treatment to respond? And so we use the actual expression of PD-L1, that protein in the tumor cell. And so what you might see is a pathologist read out staining for that protein, and they base it on a percent of how much that stains for. And so that's where I've listed below, that if it's something that's 50% or more staining and seeing that under the microscope, we expect a better response with the immunotherapy. If it's kind of 1 to 49, that's a little bit low to intermediate, and then if it's negative, a little bit more, thinking about adding other therapies to it as well. And so it's a lot of information, but I think that overall we still have a long way to go. This isn't a precise test, and I think we need to try to think about how can we look closer at these biomarkers and how can we make it more precise. And so when we look at stage 3 lung cancer, which was primarily the focus for my research and how immunotherapy has evolved in that setting, traditionally for cancer that's located in the lung and the lymph nodes in the middle of the chest and is unable to be removed or taken out surgically, standard of care treatment has been chemotherapy combined with radiation. But what we asked ourselves is, well, how can we use our immune system to perhaps try to keep the cancer from coming back or growing? And that's where durvalumab, which is one of those immunotherapy agents that blocks that stop sign in the tumor, and we found that by adding that after the chemotherapy and radiation, we've seen a really good response in both control and even shrinking the tumor. And so this was based on what's called the Pacific trial, and I don't want to focus too much on the numbers of the graph, but I just want to look at, on the top curve, you'll see the blue portion is the patients who got durvalumab or the immunotherapy, and that red portion is those who were just kind of on observation. And you can really just kind of note the separation, and that means that these patients were able to, with the treatment with immunotherapy, keep the cancer away for longer, but also live longer as well. And so from that, the FDA approved durvalumab after chemotherapy and radiation, but as you'll note on those curves, it's not perfect, it's not 100%. I think it leaves a lot of leeway into how can we improve those numbers, and I think one way is trying to figure out, well, what about the tumor itself can we actually look into trying to find ways to predict response to the immunotherapy and even kind of augment it with other treatments. So I think a good way to start for doing this is just to kind of go back and look at the patients we're treating ourselves. Not patients that are just on a study, but actual real-world patients treated here at Levine Cancer Institute. And so we did a study looking back in time of patients who had gotten that immunotherapy after chemotherapy and radiation, and used the same criteria as Pacific trial, so we're looking at a similar population of patients, and then kind of looked at outcomes. And ultimately, I think one interesting thing that we found is for those who were able to complete all of the treatment with the immunotherapy, which is up to 12 months or 24 doses, seemed to do the best, but there was still a really good percent of people in that middle that had gotten 6 months, or at least half the treatment, and seemed to do even better than those whose cancer didn't respond to the immunotherapy at all. And I think what's interesting about this to me is it tells us that we have some people who are responders to immunotherapy and people who aren't responders, that seem to have some resistance in the cancer to kind of not respond to the treatment. And it begs the question of, well, can we actually try to figure this out before we go on treatment, knowing who we think would respond and not? And so that kind of finding that difference at the 6-month mark was a bit new and something we hadn't really seen before, and I think gives us a good marker looking forward to when we can try to look at these markers in the tumor to tell who might respond. And again, it just kind of raises that, are there these mechanisms of resistance? And there are some mutations that we know in cancer that spread to other parts of the body that maybe don't respond as well to the immunotherapy, and EGFR being a very common one you might hear about. But we actually at the moment don't have too much evidence in a stage 3 where it's just in the lung and the lymph nodes. Can we use that as kind of a marker as well? And so it led us to develop just a couple hypotheses before we kind of develop any study. I think it's important to think about, well, what are we trying to actually figure out? And so the question, and kind of my hypothesis, is that there are distinct biomarkers we can use to help us predict response to immunotherapy. And on top of that, can we actually look at the individual patient and any characteristics in their history to tell us as well, on top of that, in the biomarkers, how we would expect. And so we're very, very fortunate, again, from Lung Cancer Initiative to receive funding to actually look at this, because without that, it would just be something in my head thinking about, and so I'm really grateful to have that opportunity to study. And so how are we doing that? We're currently in the process. We've been able to send away our tissue, but just to start, we identified those patients who would have fit the criteria for getting chemotherapy and radiation and received durvalumab, and can we find patients who happen to have tissue collected before the treatment and then collected after the treatment. And what we want to do is look in that tumor to see the changes over time and try to identify in these patients whose cancer's gotten worse on the immunotherapy and kind of focus on those timelines of before and after that 6 months. Can we really narrow down, well, do they have anything specific about their tumor that might have told us before even starting treatment that maybe this wouldn't have responded as well? Can we add this as a type of biomarker to look at in the future? And I think that at the moment, we're currently hopeful to have a lot of that information towards the end of the year. But really, it is a smaller study looking at it, and our goal is to try to use this to actually look in real time. You might hear the term prospective, but looking at kind of real-time patients using our understanding of what we found from this, and ultimately in the future, see if we can develop more tailored therapy for our patients. And so I appreciate you all listening to all that over time, and just want to thank you, and I think we're holding kind of questions till the end.
so much for coming. Thank you to Lung Cancer Initiative for hosting this again. I really have loved these opportunities for lectures in past years pre-COVID. Just brings our community together, and I'm looking out and seeing patients, advocates, industry, staff. It's a cool opportunity for us to come together. It is Lung Cancer Awareness Month. I'm running out of white clothing. And some things are dry clean, which I don't really do anymore. So I'm doing my best every day to wear all white and continue to really, do whatever we can to stand out, to make somebody ask, and especially in the South, why are you wearing white after Labor Day? And so winter whites or summer whites, we're doing our best. And we had our white out yesterday, and that was fun. And on Monday, we are doing something new this year. We are doing tattoos and tutus because I always take an opportunity to wear a tutu, and so we'll be doing that on Monday. And so if anybody has a white tutu, please put it on, wear it, let people ask questions, because that's the way that we spread the word and share in advancement. So I have been given the opportunity to talk about biomarker testing. Let's be clear, this cannot be covered in 20 minutes, but just really want to provide everybody with some guidance in what the heck does this mean? We hear biomarker testing, molecular sequencing, gene profiling, it's really all the same. So what we really are trying to do in a lung cancer community is ensure that everybody understands the vocabulary, and we are trying to get on a broader scale people to use the same vocabulary, so it really eliminates the questions. Did I get biomarker testing or did I get molecular sequencing? Well, it's all the same, but we really want people to know that what we're thinking about. And so I'm going to try and just kind of capture the who, what, when, where, why, how. And but I think none of that really can happen with understanding the historical context of where we've been. And for those of us who really experienced or were stressed out about Y2K and whether your computer was going to explode, I actually thought my car engine was going to die in the year 2000, and I was living in California at the time, and was very nervous. But this is what was going on. This actually was a plenary session in the 2000 Ask It Annual Meeting, published first author Jane Schiller in 2002. But this was something that we celebrated actually at that time. This clinical trial, ECOG 1594, it compared 4 first-line chemotherapy doublets. And the conclusion, and I quote, was none of 4 chemotherapy regimens offered a significant advantage over the others in the treatment of advanced non-small cell lung cancer. And that gave us confidence at the time to choose a regimen based on patient characteristics, maybe potential side effects. And it really was maybe, I think this trial gets, in retrospect, gets criticized for, well, we didn't show anything was better. We basically just said everything was even. But really, maybe this was the beginning. Maybe this was the first time we started thinking about, well, maybe docetaxel is going to contribute to more cytopenias. Maybe paclitaxel is going to give more neuropathy. Maybe Gemzar will have less hair loss. So maybe this was actually the beginning of tailoring, because you could think about the patient first and not necessarily the regimen. But we had a long way to go. And so precision medicine started actually, in the breast world and actually some of the hematologic malignancies. And when it came into the lung cancer world, and we have been kind of trendsetters in this, and continue to pave the way in precision medicine. That being said, we didn't know what we were doing when we got into it. And so erlotinib and EGFR tyrosine kinase inhibitor was really at the forefront of this, but when it was first being utilized, we had not associated it with a biomarker. It was actually first FDA approved to use in later lines of non-small cell lung cancer, not necessarily specific to the EGFR mutation. We later understood, wow, it actually does a lot better, and it's not really doing anything when that mutation is not present, when the EGFR mutation is not present. And so although erlotinib had an FDA approval in the 2005 era for just that was not biomarker associated, it really wasn't in 2010 that we started using it specifically in an EGFR mutated lung cancer, and then had its full approval in 2013, which is much later than we really were doing back in 2000, 2002. So what is a biomarker anyway? Well, it really is just anything that can be measured. So I mean, it's a super generic term, but it has a greater implication in oncology and certainly in lung cancer. But really the presence of a biomarker is a sign of something. And in this case, in the context of what we're talking about today, we're talking about something that's an abnormal process or disease. And biomarkers can represent different things. It can represent just the presence or absence of a condition. It may be something that's more prognostic. It may tell us the prognosis, how aggressive is something going to behave. And then another type of biomarker can be predictive. And so this doesn't tell you whether it's bad or good, it just tells you whether it's gonna respond to a specific treatment. Can I predict that in the presence of this, that a certain drug will work? And so a lot of what we're gonna talk about today are predictive biomarkers. So, I know I was gonna need this water. What biomarkers are used in lung cancer? Dr. Pallas had already mentioned protein expression with PD-L1 on the tumor, and how that is utilized to make a decision about the use of immunotherapy in lung cancer. PD-L1's expression, and so it's a scaled marker from 0 to 100%. Driver mutations where there's been a change in the tumor DNA, not in the person's DNA, but in the tumor's DNA, it's either there or it's not. So it's a yes, no. And so these are two different types of biomarkers, and that's what we're gonna focus on. And it's interesting as I look at this, this was part of the book chapter that I wrote in 2017, and at the time, there were only 4 biomarkers within lung cancer that had FDA-approved therapies working against those biomarkers. And at that time in 2017, that was EGFR, ALK, ROS1, and BRAF. And yet today, in 2022, every single one of these, outside of other, has an FDA approval associated with the biomarker. So that's really actually very cool. These are mutations that are identified in adenocarcinoma of the lung. Squamous cell carcinoma actually does have biomarkers as well. Some of them overlap with what is identified in more commonly in adenocarcinomas, and many of them are not. And many of the ones within squamous cell currently do not have FDA-approved therapies directed against this, and so an area of interest in ongoing research. So we know that there are mutations that exist in tumors at the DNA level that are driving that cancer, essentially changing the DNA to make the protein action different, that's leading to ongoing cell growth. And if we can identify that mutation, then how can we combat that and stop that process from happening? Well, we certainly can't do it unless we identify it, and so we need to test for it. So biomarker testing is, in general, just a way of identifying what is driving that cancer. And as Dr. Pallas showed, we're moving beyond just, is it cancer? Where did it start? What does it look like under the microscope? We want to know down to this level what is driving that cancer. And we use that in a mechanism to determine a treatment plan. And so it's important that we identify whether a biomarker is present or not, because if there is one present, then we may have a treatment that can help combat that. If it's not present, we don't want to use an incorrect treatment. So it's what I tell people often, it's not just about identifying a biomarker, it's also about identifying what's not present. So again, it's tailoring that treatment. Not having a biomarker or not identifying a biomarker is just as important as finding one, because again, it's always on the treatment plan. So biomarker testing is complex. This is not as simple as just having we'll use the example of breast cancer, having estrogen receptor testing and HER2 testing at this time. And it's certainly something in which those of us who are engaged in this are passionate about. And a lot of that is because there are different ways of testing. There are different sizes of panels that can be tested, and there are different companies or organizations that do testing and not only do testing differently, but also report differently. And so it's a foreign language that really has to be understood. And so having awareness today, even though we won't go into all the nitty gritty, is really important for people to understand the complexity, seek guidance, and seek a really strong expert opinion that can help digest the foreign language component of this. This is an example of one biomarker testing report. And I point out a few things on this. On the right-hand side, you'll see a panel of almost 1,000 biomarkers that are being tested. And this is far more than what we have current therapies from which to target, but it's all very important, and we'll get into that a little bit later. I have a specific example of a biomarker test, and I've pointed out that there's a RET fusion there, and if you're not reading that whole thing, you may miss the RET on this past the hyphen. You see these other letters beginning with K, but this is a driver mutation. This is something that's driving somebody's cancer, causing that uncontrolled growth. And you'll see at the bottom of the page, we actually have 2 FDA-approved therapies that inhibit RET. You also see another mutation, TP53. So, although this is influencing the cancer, it's not something that's targeted. And then in this same report, you'll see the BRCA2 mutation. And although we associated that with breast cancer, this is actually something that can be inherited and influences many cancers. This is separate from this person's lung cancer. However, really important when we identify germline mutations, a mutation in the person separate from a mutation in the tumor, that genetic counseling is a part of that person's next step because it influences their family. So the who, what, and the when. This is a very dynamic space in lung cancer. We are so fortunate that as we have learned how to utilize biomarkers, biomarker testing, and agents in advanced lung cancer, the world is changing in earlier stage cancers. And because these markers predict for response, we need to better move them into other settings. So currently, and this changes a month ago, when are we doing this testing? Well, it has to do with studies that are done, clinical trials that demonstrate benefit of different therapies, and certain therapies are more beneficial in certain markers than in others. And so recently we've had FDA approvals for the utilization of immunotherapy before a curative surgery. We also have FDA approvals for immunotherapy and EGFR targeted therapy after curative surgery. And so the only way that we know when to use these is if we're testing for that. And you can see these are very few mutations. These aren't 1,000 panel mutations. So in this setting, identifying, RET in this setting would not be something that would be treated with a RET inhibitor, but you still want that knowledge. So, do you need 1,000 gene test for a stage 1 resected lung cancer? No, you don't today. We're certainly hoping that in the future that information will have greater pertinence and we'll understand how to use that information. So why are we doing all of this? I think I'm kind of getting there and explaining that. I was so proud of this chart. It's a really interesting process to go back through slide decks that you've made throughout your career and see the evolution of what you discuss and when things take off. But I was really proud of this chart in 2017 because we had an array of targeted therapies against these 4 biomarkers. And what's even cooler is this is 2022. So things are happening, and in the past 5 years, actually, there have been 35 treatments approved in the space of lung cancer. Not all of them within the targeted therapies that you've seen here, but also in the immunotherapy setting. So, we know we've got the drugs, but what does that mean, and when do we use that testing? Well, we want to get biomarker testing at diagnosis. And the reason for that is because there are agents, like you see here, osimertinib, which is an EGFR inhibitor that's very effective in the treatment of EGFR mutated metastatic non-small cell lung cancer. You don't have to understand what's happening here, but anything that's below that middle line is a response. And actually, those few that are above the line are stable disease. So essentially, a very impressive response to osimertinib. This was the first in human study. So this was, and we actually participated in this, and Dr. Hagstrom was our local principal investigator here, and it's just we've been a part of osimertinib since its birth, essentially, and really incredible to watch its evolution over time. Just as impressively, alectinib, which is an ALK inhibitor. I bring up this one as well just to demonstrate why this is so important, because 30% of metastatic lung cancers have involvement of the brain at diagnosis. And so it's important for us to identify new therapies that penetrate the blood-brain barrier. And many of these newer agents are effective in that. Alectinib, just an example here, you can see this response just after 6 weeks. And what this has done is it's changed survival. So with the utilization of alectinib in an ALK rearranged metastatic non-small cell lung cancer, 60% of people are alive at 5 years, and that's certainly something that was not even fathomable when Jen Schiller stood up and gave that presentation at ASCO annual meetings 22 years ago. I've already mentioned that it's important to know what's present. It's important to know what's present because it not only impacts what you're giving, but maybe what you're not giving. So in the targeted therapy space, we think about these mutations, these driver mutations, but also the PD-L1. So in the setting of somebody who has a tumor that may contain an EGFR mutation, that tumor is going to be sensitive to osimertinib, but it's not going to be sensitive to immunotherapy. And so it's really important, even though we may get back a PD-L1 marker that's 70%, and as Dr. Pallas pointed out, that's a high marker, and we would think that that would portend a better response to immunotherapy. That's not the case when certain drivers are in place, and we've demonstrated that. And so we know it's important for us to have that information up front. Sometimes immunotherapy may be initiated inappropriately prior to that mutational information being back. And we know that a tumor that contains an EGFR mutation is not going to respond to immunotherapy. Proper treatment is administered, such as osimertinib, there's a potential for increased toxicity because of the mix of those two agents. So it's not only an efficacy issue, it's a safety issue. And so we need to be a part of that. We need to be asking, have my biomarkers been tested? Do we have those back before we're starting treatment? Am I comfortable with waiting for that information so that I can ensure that I am being treated with precision? And sometimes it doesn't happen at diagnosis. Sometimes biomarker testing gets done later, and so it's important that if it even wasn't done at diagnosis, that it get done at progression. And this is another case in point. So this is selpercatinib and erect fusion metastatic non-small cell lung cancer patient population, and the targeted therapy is still the better therapy. So you can see here on the left the patients that were treated as with their first treatment with a targeted therapy. However, for people who were treated with this targeted therapy even later in their course of treatment plans and had received chemotherapy previously, they still had an incredible response. So we still, there's never a wrong time to get biomarker testing. And importantly, just building off of that, biomarker testing at progression, even if it was tested previously, we want to know how it's changed, especially if a targeted therapy has been initiated. I think of this as, putting the boulder in the waterfall. We've put a boulder in a waterfall, we've put the targeted therapy in place, to block the cancer, but we understand, we know how water works, we know how gravity works. There's going to be a trickle at some point that somehow seeps around the edge, and we have to understand where that's coming from. We have to understand why that soil is moist over there and that something's escaping so that we can block that as well. It's important not only to know it, but it changes the way we treat things. In ALK, and this is not specific to ALK, but I'm just using this as an example, but for ALK inhibitors, the landscape is that we're so fortunate to have, here there are 5 ALK inhibitors that are listed here, and much like a stoplight, you see some reds and some yellows where maybe certain ALK inhibitors are not going to be an effective treatment, even though there's an ALK rearrangement. Some are more resistant to therapies than others. So it's not just knowing the rearrangement, but it's knowing which one. And so G1202R is one that's actually resistant to quite a few therapies, but it's sensitive to lorlatinib. And this usually emerges after somebody's been treated with a first or second generation ALK inhibitor. So we can't be willy-nilly and just switching things up. We have to have purpose, and all it takes is repeat biomarker testing. Dr. Pallas talked about PD-L1, so I'm not going to go through much of this, but it's dynamic and can be quite variable. And so it's understanding that percentage, and here's a biomarker testing report example demonstrating a higher PD-L1 expression at 70%. When we look at the distribution around our population as to, how many tumors are PD-L1 0, 1 to 49, and greater than 50, it's about a third. Within our patients that are seen at Levine Cancer Institute, and this is compiled data over, I think maybe 2019, we actually have a larger patient population, closer to 47% that have PD-L1 zeros, and about 27% for 1 to 49 and 50 to 100%. It doesn't make one better than the other, doesn't make one right or wrong. It again just helps us understand how to identify the best treatment. And this is the landscape that's evolving within immunotherapy, and I'll just add to this that just 2 days ago, if I'm right on my calendar, cemiplimab got another FDA approval for combination with chemotherapy. So we're continuing to see more options within this space, and a lot of these are determined based on that PD-L1 expression. So we need to be aware of that so that we can identify what we think is going to be that best response. And it happens because of studies like this is Keynote 24, that was the utilization of pembrolizumab as monotherapy, just a single agent, non-chemotherapy based for PD-L1s greater than or equal to 50%. And we were able to see that, you know, those responses are durable over time, similar to the graphs that Dr. Pallas showed with earlier stage lung cancer utilizing immunotherapy after chemotherapy and radiation. These are patients with metastatic lung cancer with long-term survivals because the use of a single agent that's not a chemotherapy-based regimen. And, you know, we do all of this. We do the testing, we do the investigation, because this is the landscape of targeted therapy in non-small cell lung cancer. And that's not just the, you know, the driver mutations, the EGFRs, the METs, the RETs, it's the PD-L1s, you know, in addition to that. That, you know, example of a biomarker test had so much more on it than just the ones that have FDA approvals. And this is where biomarker testing can be additionally important if considering a clinical trial. And it's not just the ones that have FDA approvals, it's the ones that are maybe up and coming. And so one of the things that we have really felt strongly about our clinical trial profile as at Levine Cancer Institute is those mechanisms of resistance, and how do we really identify clinical trials that are beyond the first line, that are really thinking about, you know, what are we going to do next? And so it may be a drug that's already FDA approved, such as sotorasib and KRAS G12C. It's how do we improve upon what we have already achieved? It's how do we make combinations of therapies? And so we have a clinical trial that's looking at that. We have a new valent drug that's a dynamic ROS1 inhibitor, I'll show you. We have the Crestone study with seribantumab, which targets NRG1 fusions. And then ASCO TAPER study, which is really a very unique design. It's essentially taking FDA-approved targeted therapies and utilizing them in the tumor that has the mutation, and it's not driven by the point of origin. For example, if there is a drug that's been FDA approved for kidney cancer based on a certain finding in kidney cancer, but somebody in lung cancer has that same finding, then they can get that FDA approved agent that's outside of label, but we know the safety profile, and it allows us to use things that aren't necessarily tumor specific, but really at the crux of the biomarker itself. It's not just in these targets, it's the PD-L1 and other immune-based markers of identifying outside of the PD-1, PD-L1 platform. How else can we build off of the immune checkpoint inhibition? So I just bring this up. This is this clinical trial that we have here at Levine Cancer Institute that is a ROS1 selective agent. We do have ROS1 inhibitors that are FDA approved and very effective, but again, what we're trying to identify as, you know, is there one that may overcome a resistance pattern? How do we get blood-brain barrier penetration? And this one is very promising. It does actually cover one of the resistant mutations that develop after ROS1 inhibition has already occurred. And so this drug also has very excellent CNS penetration. We know that lorlatinib is an excellent drug, and this one in development demonstrates great penetration as well. NRG1 is a rearrangement or fusion protein that does not have an FDA-approved target. And if you're looking at one of these complicated biomarker reports, you're going to see this says somatic, which means that it's in the tumor. Germline means it's in the patient DNA, but this is somatic, so it's in the tumor DNA, potentially actionable. And so what does that mean? Well, in this report, it actually lists some clinical trials that are available, and you'll see one here lists Charlotte, North Carolina, and that's here with the utilization of seribantumab in Dr. Carrizosa was the first author and presenter of this at ASCO annual meeting this past year of the initial efficacy and safety results of this in tumors harboring NRG1 fusions. And this wasn't specific to non-small cell lung cancer. It just happens that that most of the patients had non-small cell lung cancer. And so again, just everything under that line in that waterfall is considered to be a response. And not only that, but there was early response with 75% within the first 6 weeks and longer durations of response. So these biomarker reports, and the importance of the biomarker testing is not only are you identifying maybe what you can use today, but maybe what you can use tomorrow. This is a great example of maybe what you can use tomorrow. So KRAS G12D, the important thing here is that we have a KRAS G12C FDA approved inhibitor, and all KRAS mutations are not the same. It would be inappropriate to be treated with a KRAS G12C inhibitor if there's a KRAS G12D mutation. That drug's not going to work, and so you're not going to receive the best therapy for that. And there are clinical trials working toward inhibiting KRAS G12D. But you'll also see some other somatic, biologically relevant mutations here. And so what do these mean? Well, maybe we don't know yet. Maybe these are variants of unknown significance. But if it's unknown significance today, it may be significant tomorrow. So we have to make note of that. And we have to keep on testing. We have to keep on identifying them and follow trends and identify what we can combat. But CDK2 and alpha is one that's listed here. And what's important here, this is just one of 3 pages of study arms within that taper study that I mentioned. And there is a cohort for CDK2A, CDK4, CD6 using abemaciclib. Is a potential target and a potential effective therapy as an opportunity. So we need to be looking beyond just the one that has the approval. But what else do we do with this information? Well, we get expert opinion. We go to our molecular tumor board. We ask everyone across the space, does anybody know anything about SMAD4? Has anybody seen it in other tumor types? It may not be happening in lung cancer, but maybe it's happening, in gastric cancer. And we need to hear from our gastric colleagues to see what they are doing. So using a molecular tumor board, whether it's at your institution or even on a broader level, is very important as this information just continues to drive the complexity of our understanding. It's also about longitudinal assessment. So this is not standard, but it's certainly an area of attention and something we're watching is, what kind of responses are we getting once we target whatever's driving that? How deep can we get that remission? Can we have circulating tumor cells in the blood and start a therapy and eliminate them? And how does that tell us about the future durability of that drug in somebody's treatment plan? And so there are mechanisms for us to have a longitudinal assessment of what's happening on a very cellular level to tumor cells. And then, if we were to start to see something rise again, what are the implications there? How are we going to utilize that information? And this is an area of growth and research. How do we do these tests? Many people know it can be done through tissue and blood. So tissue, it's going to take a needle, and it's going to take quite a bit. So as you can see, we're testing quite a bit. And so we need the proper sampling. We need good sampling to be able to do that. It doesn't have to be on the primary tumor. It can be on a metastatic lesion. It shouldn't be on bone. And really the benefit of tumor testing is in getting a tissue biopsy is really that's still the only way we're going to get a diagnosis confirmation of lung cancer. When we test the blood, we don't know that it came from the lung. We don't know that it came from the colon, but we can still get those circulating tumor cells. The benefit of a liquid biopsy is that it's less invasive. We're actually, when we send those off for testing, we get the turnaround time much more quickly. And I think what's important to understand about all of these tests is that a positive test is a true test. You know, there aren't fake positives. They're real. Negative test really doesn't mean that there's an absence of one, and so you just have to keep on looking. And I've had a patient that I knew had a driver mutation, and I kept on looking, and I kept on looking. I sent the blood over and over and over, and I biopsied over and over and over, and we did it for years until I found it. And it was a really important moment, and it just, you know, there's just this sense of relief that we knew, and we tried. And I sound like a little engine that could. But, you know, additional biopsies, I think, you know, what I tell people is we're going to follow this, we're going to keep on testing. That's just part of the deal. And and for all of the reasons that we've talked about today, there are many ways that can be done, whether it's single gene testing or next generation sequencing. We're really at a point where we've got too many mutations, and it needs to be done on a greater platform. It needs to be done with these larger panels rather than the single gene testing. There's still a role for single gene testing. Maybe in the earlier stages, we do have rapid turnaround time. I'll give an example of a patient recently. Again, I mean, I didn't want to wait. You know, we're all impatient. We all want to do things. You know, tissue had been sent off, blood had been sent off, and I also knew that I could get a blood turnaround time on an EGFR single mutation in 24 hours. And I said, you know what, shoot, let's just also send your blood for EGFR. You know, and if it's positive, great, we got that in 24 hours. If it's negative, we're still working on all these other things that's been sent. Turns out that was positive. And so I actually knew within 24 hours as to the direction we needed to go. And that was a personal decision and a discussion with somebody about that. But it was imperative that we get that information as quickly as we could. There's still problems with all of this. You know, this was a really important discussion. This is at ASCO 2021, and this was virtually done, and Dr. Bruno really uncovered the disparities in biomarker testing, and specifically was looking at Black African Americans versus white Caucasians, and really noticed that there's a real difference in the number of Black African American patients who are getting next generation sequencing. The difference being statistically significant and recognizing an inherent need for to increase awareness and ensure that everybody is getting tested and everybody is getting the correct testing. I've done some work on this on a national level as well. When I was chair of the Cancer Research Committee at ASCO, you know, we took an initiative to not only do some data dives, but do some surveys. This was just this past year's presentation in 2022 at ASCO, and looking at biomarker testing in the Cancer LUNGe Discovery Database. And we started out with almost 35,000 lung cancer patients, and boiled that down into our final cohort of 8,700, and looking at the biomarker testing. And you know, biomarker testing has gone up every year. That's great. It's still not where it needs to be. You know, we think that biomarker testing should be 100%, and we're not even close to that. You know, testing rates had increased in 2011 from 32% to 62% in 2017. And so there was a steady increase. But what's really interesting to me is that even though we know that everybody should be tested, even in 2017, the majority of the testing was done in female Asian never smokers. And that's a profile that historically made sense, maybe in 2005, but certainly not today. We did a survey as well to try and understand what the physician was thinking, you know, not just what was being done, but what's going on in the minds of physicians when they're doing biomarker testing. What are they doing? You know, who are they testing? When are they testing? And one of the things that stood out through that entire survey was physician concern about delaying treatment while awaiting biomarker testing. what we know is that there are excellent therapies out there. We also know that getting the therapy that matches the tumor is the best for the patient. Having that information up front is important, but there's angst and an eagerness to start treatment, and sometimes people start treatment before they have that information back. But what drives that? So, you know, really everyone believes that biomarker testing should be back in our hands within 2 weeks of ordering it. We recognize that that's not often what's happening, and more than a third of these physician responders said that they were waiting an average of 3 to 4 weeks to even get the testing. So that means that a patient is waiting to get the information on not even knowing what their treatment plan is going to be. And you will see that actually there's a portion of people that start treatment prior to getting that information back, and it's really important that, you know, we understand why that's happening and how we can change that on so many different levels, so that we can continue to, again, it's about efficacy and safety, and having that information. Great things are happening. Dr. Pallas, you know, just seeing that hope sign with that ribbon, it just, you know, it's just really beautiful to see. When the NCI published its updated survival information in lung cancer in 2020, it was just a really exciting piece of literature to read. And it was the first time that mortality rates for non-small cell lung cancer were declining faster than the incidence. And that really comes back to the initiation of biomarker testing and identifying these alterations and then utilizing some of these newer therapies. That data really was prior to the implementation of immunotherapy, so we are looking forward as we continue to get these mortality rates in the future. And, you know, that's where just as Jenny mentioned at the very beginning, you know, what Lung Cancer Initiative is doing and expanding its mission and recognizing survivors and bringing the whole family into this. We have a tremendous obligation and opportunity to continue the research that pushes this forward, to continue our education so that people understand what's out there, and to ensure that we're embracing those who are touched by lung cancer in any capacity, so that we continue to have historical years every year in this space, because it's such an impactful cancer. So grateful for, you know, support groups. This is a cancer where we do have a growing number of survivors, but, you know, there needs to be greater support for all of those. And a lot of the mutations, the driver mutations, actually have these teams, and some are represented here today. And so really, these are great contacts. So with that, I just say thank you. This is biomarker testing is imperative. It's complicated. It's going to continue to be complicated. We're all doing the best we can to simplify it, make it available, and make it available faster, so that, you know, the whole treatment team can have answers and move forward.
My name is Raychelle, Leonard, and I was invited here to share my story. So my story starts in November 2013. I was invited out to the Triad Lunge Forward 5K event in Greensboro by a friend of mine. She had a team, wanted me to participate, so I go out, have a great time. It's actually the first time I've ever heard of this group. I've never heard of anything relating to lung cancer prior to 2013. January 2014, my father was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. He'd had bronchitis like a few months before, couldn't get rid of his cough, went back to the doctor. They saw what they said was like a really small dot, but they weren't too concerned about it, said they would monitor it and follow up in 3 months. So by the time he goes back in January for his 3 months, we're at stage 4. So he goes, he has surgery, removes most of his left lung, radiation, chemo. His was pretty aggressive. Funny enough, my sister and I had signed him up to participate in the triad LUNGe Forward, which was scheduled to take place on November 8th of 2014. Guess Dad decided he didn't want to take part in that. He died the day before. But we still got up as a team, went out, participated, honored him, and I've actually been a member of the Charlotte Planning Committee ever since. I am currently the chairperson for the Charlotte LUNGe Forward 5K. As mentioned before, our event next year is May 20th, 2023. I want to take a minute to acknowledge my committee members, some of which are in this room. So hi, ladies. Good to see you. We have a lot of fun on that committee. It's a very dear cause for me. I can't do anything to eradicate lung cancer, but it makes me feel like I'm doing a little bit to help those who are affected by it. You know, most of our committee members are comprised of people who are either currently going through lung cancer or have had someone, a family member, that was affected by it. So it's a really nice, intimate community. We all look out for each other. I love being a part of it, whether I'm chairperson or not. I've made a lot of really good friends and a lot of good people, and we've lost some really good people too. So if anyone is interested in joining our committee, we're always looking for new people, new ideas, new ways to raise money, just anything. Like, we are open and we are very welcome and we're very warm. So thank you for your time today. Thank you for letting me share my story. Thank you for letting me get it out without crying. And I hope to see some of you soon. Dr. Mileham, we did a radio interview last year. You remember that? Yes. So it's good to see you today too. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you all so much for coming today. It was